My analytical framework is I'm going to compare two different versions of black gold, oil and coffee. And I'm going to start with the case for coffee as being black gold. This is from the New York Times. A student of mine was so excited about seeing this argument, this article in the Times, that he sent it to me. And it talks about how the economist Adam Smith wrote much of his masterpiece, The Wealth of Nations, in the British Coffee House, a popular meeting place for Scottish intellectuals, among whom he discussed early drafts of his book or circulated early drafts of his book for discussion. No doubt there was some time wasting going on in coffee houses, but their merits far outweighed their drawbacks. They provided a lively social and intellectual environment which gave rise to a stream of innovations that shaped the modern world. Now, this reminded me of a friend of mine, Sabine Mahmood, who started a similar sort of place, coffee house, discussion space in Karachi. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the case she wrote from our journal. 24 years ago, I fell in love for the first time with a Macintosh Plus computer. It had a tiny 9-inch screen, an 8 megahertz processor, 1 megabyte of RAM, and no hard disk. It was the computer for the rest of us, and it profoundly altered the course of my life. I mean, you talk about American soft power. You know, it's fantastic to see sort of Sabine inspired this way. But her innovation to create the second floor was really also about political change. And she talked about how years of military rule, terrible violence, and a range of other events had stripped people of their political will and the desire to be the change they wished to see. And this space was the space that she envisioned. The second floor was about creating that kind of opportunity for people to commute, create, and share. So the argument for oil as black gold really is about mid-20th century production functions. This is directly from Solo 1957, inputs lead to outputs. And so we need oil as a vitally important input to our production. It drives our transportation and so forth and so on. 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. The United States responded. And January 23rd, 1980, Jimmy Carter issued a statement that's come to known as the Carter Doctrine. The region, which is now threatened by Soviet troops in Afghanistan, is of great strategic importance. It contains more than 2/3 of the world's exportable oil. Let our position be clear, and an attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. We created U.S. Central Command to keep the Soviets out of Iran. This did not go away. Candidate Barack Obama in 2008 made this statement when he accepted the nomination in Denver. For the sake of our security, the future of our planet, I will set a clear goal as president. In 10 years, we will finally end our dependence on semiconductors from Asia. Oh, no. Okay, hold on. I'm sorry. I said, we will finally end our dependence on potatoes from... I just loaded these. We will finally end our dependence on grapes from Chile. Another thing we used to make that we import. No. Oh, no, it was oil from the Middle East. That's what it was. It was oil from... Anyway, he was not alone. Sarah Palin, John McCain held similar views. Richard Nixon, had similar views. And even as recently as 2015, we quote this. You guys quote this in your paper. U.S. imports have decreased substantially, reducing the funds we send overseas and reducing our vulnerability to global disruption and supply shocks. This is 2015. It's brand new. This is the leading edge thinking of our national security apparatus. It's just freshly in print. It's just so exciting to see. And even you guys allude without question that spikes in oil prices are correlated with recessions in the United States. So what's so special about the Middle East and oil? I mean, it's a fascinating thing. Well, one thing that people in the Middle East did in 1973 was they made us wait in line. And we really don't like that. We really don't like waiting in line in the United States. That is very Soviet, and we do not like it. I'll get back to that. But actually, one thing we've forgotten is the reasons we had to wait in line in 1973 was because Richard Nixon imposed economy-wide wage and price controls as a consequence of inflation at the time. He was trying to get elected. And by the way, this gives me an opportunity to wish you all here at the Cato Institute happy May Day. It is May 1st. And, so you can imagine if our current president were to impose economy-wide wage and price controls, what that would be greeted with. But in the event, when we think about supply shocks, there's one thing that was a kind of a supply shocking sort of event, which the Iran-Iraq War. It killed over 1 million people, and it was the longest sustained military conflict in the 20th century, aside from World War II. Oh, and look what it did to supply of oil from Iran and Iraq. Not quite as smooth as Canada and Norway, but steadily increasing throughout the entire war. I would say that that was the supply shock, and I don't really see much evidence that it disrupted output from those countries. Now, there was a guy, I don't know if anybody's heard of him, he's kind of obscure figure named Ben Bernanke, and he wrote a paper on this topic, and what he found, and I guess he was just making it up because he was just an academic at that point, and then he became a more important person, we forgot about what he wrote, but what he said was that the recessionary correlation with oil supply shocks was due almost entirely to the response, the monetary policy response. It was the overreaction to the supply shock that led to recessions, not the supply shock itself. That's Ben Bernanke, but anyway, you don't have to believe him. Good news, though, is we're about to supply Saudi Arabia as a top producer of oil. That's delightful, and I think everyone's very excited about it. I mean, for the United States to be the next Saudi Arabia is such a step forward for everything that we stand for in this country. Now, let's go back to coffee. There's another way of thinking about production that takes the production function model that we all learned as undergraduates a little step further. We have inputs, that's the stuff you need to make cookies. We have outputs, that's the cookie you make. But then there's how you do what you do, right? Well, it turns out how you do what you do is really important. My George Mason colleague, Tyler Cowen, just recently posted this to his blog. And it turns out that in a world where 5/6 of what was really capital and labor input, stuff you could replicate if you were trying to copy a company, that was 5/6 of value in S&P 500 companies just a couple of decades ago. Now it's 1/6. 5/6 of value in S&P 500 companies is the how you do it. It's intangibles. It is not the solo model, and it is not dependence on oil or any other resource that is fixed and tangible that creates the prosperity in this country. Oh, and by the way, Apple just surpassed Exxon. This was a few years ago as the #1 world's most valued company. So, by the way, Exxon, Apple, oil, ever heard of using a computer in a coffee house? That's the way I spend all my time. Now, since it is May Day, I'm going to go back to that, and I want to remind you of one of the great heroes of this country, Time Man of the Year in 1941. Oh, sorry, I slipped right by him. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin, Time Man of the Year in 1941. Now, of course, there was a reason that Joseph Stalin was Time Man of the Year, was because he was helping us fight Time Man of the Year in 1938, Adolf Hitler. And it was bad corner turned in the attack on Pearl Harbor, so Hitler was out. Stalin was in for a certain time period. Of course, that turned in the very wrong direction. And then by 1979, the Soviets did what was one of the most monumentally stupid things that any country has ever done, which was to invade Afghanistan. But nonetheless, it scared us enough that we made friends with a group of people called the Mujahideen. By the way, anybody who's a doctoral student, I strongly urge you to look into the National Security Archives or wherever you can get the data on Eliza Van Hollen. Eliza Van Hollen had been at the Afghanistan desk for exactly 1 week when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and she spent her time while she was at the State Department writing memos saying that the Mujahideen were not, in fact, our friends. And should we arm and train and support them, that ultimately it would be a bad idea. And that's exactly what happened. So I had a little slide along the way about our enemies. My enemy's enemy is my next enemy. And we saw that in the case of Stalin. We saw that in the case of Saddam Hussein, who we trained to fight the Iranians because they were the foe of the day. That did not work out particularly well. We saw it in the case of the Mujahideen. My enemy's enemy is my next enemy. This is the history of U.S. foreign policy strategy for the last 50 years. Stalin, Saddam Hussein, the Mujahideen, these are not small cases. These are not minor exceptions. These are core to the narrative of U.S. foreign policy for the last 50 years. Now, another thing that we did immediately after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was we needed somebody to work with as we were arming the Mujahideen 19, because we were so worried about the fact that the Soviets were going to invade Iran and control oil supplies. So conveniently, there was a general, General Zia in Pakistan, who had taken control of the country just in 1977. And so we saw an opportunity through the interintelligence services in Pakistan to support our new initiative against the Soviets. Now, one thing that General Zia did was he imposed the anti-blasphemy laws, and generally started to convert Pakistan, which had been fairly secular, and until General Zia took control, one of the fastest growing countries in the world. It was the South Korea of its moment, right? But General Zia had a different idea for the direction of Pakistan, and again, he was our enemy's enemy, so he became our friend. The ISI has had a kind of interesting history since we were its best buddies, and it is well known to all foreign policy experts that the U.S. relationship with the ISI has become complicated over time. Human Rights Watch issued this report in 2011 about a particularly sort of troublesome set of events going on in Baluchistan, where a number of people have gone missing. There is a Baluch separatist movement. I barely know anything about it. I wouldn't really know much about it at all, except that my friend Sabine Mahmood, who I mentioned earlier, held an event just last Friday, just a week ago. And this was an event that was going to be held at Lahore University Management School, which is one of the leading universities in Pakistan, but it was canceled ostensibly, reportedly, I didn't hear this challenge, at the request of the ISI. The event went pretty well. There weren't too many disturbances, but as Sabine was riding home on her motorcycle with her mother, she was shot 5 times and killed. So that's the extent of our support well, it's a troubling event. And I bring it to you today because I think when we think back on how we got to where we are today, the rot is much deeper than we take it to be. And the sort of things that Sabine stood for were more central to the values of this country than almost anything I know my fellow Americans are doing today here in this country.